Hey, Derek.
Hey, Diane.
So I have a question for you. Tell me how you got to work today.
Oh, gosh. Well, let me see. As I wait and wait and wait for Montreal's new light rail system to expand to the West Island, I do what I typically did. I drove to a bus terminal, hopped on an express bus, connected to the metro, and made my way down to campus.
You want to know how I got to work today?
Oh, yes. Why don't you tell me that?
I walked and then I took a Bixi, which is part of Montreal's bike share service. I bet you're wondering why I'm asking you this question.
I am curious why you're so interested in this. It doesn't seem like the most scintillating subject of all.
Actually, it's probably more interesting than you'd think. I think how people like you, who lives in a suburb, and me, who lives downtown, get to work tells us a lot about how a city like Montreal is organized, what they choose to spend money on, and lots of things like that.
That does sound interesting. What does it have to do with this podcast?
Well, I'll tell you. I had the great opportunity to sit down with one of Canada's best-known urban planners. He's someone who does work at the intersection of public transport and public policy. He looks at things like how where our buses and metros go affects poverty, how cities are adapting to climate change, and how planning from the top can affect how all of us live our lives in cities.
That does sound interesting. I'll have to listen to it on my commute home tonight.
Just make sure you drive safely. Welcome to Mark My Words. I'm Diane Fagan. Today I am delighted to be joined by Professor Kevin Manaugh. Professor Kevin Manaugh is an associate professor jointly appointed to the Department of Geography and the Bieler School of Environment. He studies cities and particularly urban transport systems and how various personal, institutional, and government decision-making processes affect how cities grow and develop. Professor Manaugh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot. Happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about cities, but before we hit the virtual streets, I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself. Maybe you could tell us a bit about your background, how you got interested in urban studies, and how you wound up at McGill.
Great. Good. Thanks for having me here. I have an actual sort of convoluted career path to get here, so I'll take a few minutes to describe it. I actually have a degree in music and environmental studies, but for various reasons, I was always interested in environment and how the environment and cities sort of work together. But then, basically over time, I drifted towards really having this passion about, how cities are built, how people interact with them, the environmental impacts of transport systems. And also, kind of as an aside, I grew up, we moved a lot as a kid. So I've lived in big cities. I've lived in tiny towns in the Midwest, United States. I've lived in European capitals. I've lived in lots of different kind of places. So I always had this kind of fascination and obsession with understanding the differences and similarities between places, understanding how people use public space, and then especially this kind of long-standing, basically borderline obsession with transport systems and understanding, how they work, how they're different, and getting really into, bike systems. And I lived in Boulder, Colorado for my undergrad, and they had an amazing system of bike lanes. It was the first time I ever experienced this kind of thing where, completely separate from traffic. And so you could get anywhere you want, without interacting with cars and go up into the mountains and do what you needed to do. And so that really just, gave me this interest. And I eventually went and did a master's and PhD in urban planning here at McGill. And then I was lucky enough to just basically move from the from the School of Urban Planning over to Geography and School of Environment about 12 years ago.
So that's a lot of cities to have lived in. And if we have time at the end, I'm going to ask you what your favorite city is from an urban planning point
Fair
of view.
enough. Yeah.
But before we get to that, many people listening probably actually live in cities. Most of us do. But even though we experience them every day as, residents and as commuters and as citizens, I don't think most of us know a lot about how cities are planned and organized. How do places end up looking and feeling the way that they do? And I guess how much of that is planning and how much of it is organic, would you say?
Yeah, great question. I think so much of one of the main takeaways, if you're thinking about cities from a planning perspective, is just how there aren't a lot of accidents. I mean, things are planned. There's reasons why things the way they are in terms of, legal frameworks and bylaws and zoning laws and cultural norms and things. But that's not just by accident. When you look around a city, it's a result of decisions that have been made from either very recently or going back decades. I think that's one of the main things to think about as you walk around a city and you see, the quality of the sidewalks, you see the bike lanes, you see the transit system, you see the space given to cars, you see all these things. Those are decisions that are made, and that the politicians and that we and participating in democracy can have some say in, and which is something around in Montreal, and we've been lucky for the past couple of years to have an administration that's very pro cycling, and making sort of common sense rules around parking and space devoted to cars and these kind of things. But it's very much a result of decisions that have been made by a bunch of people.
I think that's interesting because, again, I think sometimes cities feel like these kind of big, messy things where maybe there isn't that much influence from the top. But knowing that it is possible to make a good city, design a good city, and ensure that a city stays a good city because of decisions that we can actually affect is, it's empowering and it's kind of interesting. So as you mentioned earlier, one of the things that you focus on is transportation specifically. And one of the things that I think your work has focused on, if I'm right, is something we might consider transportation equity. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about what that means, and how urban transport interacts with things like poverty and housing and access to jobs and services in a way that kind of affects the sort of socioeconomic circumstances of people living in cities.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. And the way I try to explain the idea of transport equity, to my students, or is really who gets to participate in the city and in life. There's so many barriers. I mean, transport offers both barriers and opportunities. In terms of who has access to what, and who benefits from the good things and who's exposed to the bad things. In terms of transport generates pollution. Cars and vehicles generate pollution and generate danger and these kind of things. But a lot of what I study is who has access to the safe bike lanes and the safe, comfortable places to walk, and who's exposed to the pollutants and exposed to the traffic danger and exposed to, or has to, live far outside the city in order to afford, where they're living. And that question you asked around affordability, the sort of connection between transport and affordability is very key in terms of, where places in the city are affordable, and building enough demand or building enough supply for the demand of that types of, lots of people want to live in walkable places, with good bike lanes and that don't have cars speeding through them. But that's how we define a lot of our areas. They're car dependent. They're not pleasant to walk in. They're not easy to cycle around in. And so there's an imbalance in the sort of housing market there in terms of what's actually available to rent or own.
I think it's interesting that we might at one time have thought that the ability to live in, have a car and live in a car-friendly place was a luxury, and that having to live in a densely packed, walkable place was something more for kind of working class people. And now, of course, that's flipped. So I wonder if you can give me some examples of policies that can actually remedy that. Because when I think of cities that I've lived in, that's very often the case. The people who have access to all the life of the city are people who have a lot of money. And what policies can actually help change that?
Yeah. I mean, before I answer that, I think it's, you bring up such an interesting point about like the way we've, cars have been around for about 100 years. I talk about this a lot with my students, and but cities have been around for about 8,000 years. And so if you kind of think about the reality of the last, many thousands of years of human habitation, we've had cities and villages and, human settlement patterns that did not have cars for a very, very, very long time. And what's one of the things, if I look into the future, I always think that we're probably like future historians will look back at this time and really kind of wonder, like, why was there this like 100-year sort of place where society, went kind of off the deep end and sort of gave up, all the sort of aspects of livability and the sort of fun aspects of cities completely kind of, gave way for cars, this very dangerous, incredibly polluting, not efficient way of getting around. And, it's my hope and my dream that one day we look back at this and realize how sort of unfounded that idea was. And to get more to your question, I mean, transport questions often are kind of, and housing policies are often very related. And so, social housing, cities like Vienna do this so well in terms of having like, housing policy, social housing policy that makes it possible for people to live, in these dense, vibrant areas that are, that they don't have to live far away or be exposed to all the pollutants of this, dangerous and traffic, congestion in these kind of places. And so I think housing affordability, social housing policy are very central to these questions around, who can live in these areas. And as you say, I think there's been a shift in recent years in terms of these kinds of dense, vibrant, urban areas are clearly there's a market for it. People want to live in these places, and even a few generations ago, there was such a movement, towards the suburbs and more sort of leafy green places, and there still is that pressure, obviously, but there is a lot of people realizing, the benefits of living in a happy, healthy, exciting, vibrant area.
I'm hard to hear you say that you think that this could be, we could look back on this with some optimism, and that suggests to me that you think things could be better and that there are places doing it better. Beyond the issues of equity, another huge issue many of us are thinking about is how cities contribute to and cope with climate change. Obviously, there was catastrophic flooding in Texas earlier this year. There were the LA wildfires. We've had terrible fires in Western Canada that have impacted us across the country. So from an urban planning point of view, how do you think about these types of climate emergencies that we're focusing on? And what are we learning about how to build more climate resilient cities?
Yeah, it's an interesting fact that cities are both, on some level a cause of some of these, pollutants and things, but also a place for solutions, and, there's, cities are a place where lots of, pollution is happening, but it's also a place where the policy can change things to reduce that, and both on kind of a local scale as well as, I think, as your question implies, on a sort of more international scale in terms of in terms of cities being a place where it's much easier and possible to not depend on cars and to to be able to walk and cycle and use transit and these kind of things, which do have global impacts in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also, cities are, as you say, it's horrific to see what's happening, happened in LA recently, or in these urban areas in Texas that flooded, and that is a fairly recent phenomenon in human history, again, in terms of where there's just more people living in more places that are exposed to these wildfires, and so we're seeing, when growing up, I never heard of entire towns being destroyed. It's actually horrific to see what's going on in some of these Canadian towns and cities that are impacted by wildfires.
So maybe we can kind of move on to the solution side then. And I think when we think about these problems, whether they're socioeconomic problems or whether there's climate problems, these are complicated problems to solve, and they involve lots of different fields. I feel like you need architecture, and you need engineering, and you need urban planning, and you need policy, and you need ecology, and you need engineering and sociology, and probably lots of things. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you here at McGill in the Bieler School of the Environment, which is an interdisciplinary kind of an enterprise, the new sustainability park that McGill is planning to build, which will bring people together in new ways. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how universities, and McGill in particular, can help to bring people together to look at these problems from a bunch of different angles.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm lucky enough to, as you say, to collaborate with people from a wide variety of fields, whether it is, in my own department, geography and school of environment, but economists and folks in the School of Environment or School of Planning, and engineering. I collaborate with lots of people at Polytechnique as well, and here, and which I think leads to better research, better ideas, better solutions. And because, as you say, transport solutions or urban solutions or the problems themselves are so multidisciplinary. You're talking about, part of it is about, there's a psychological element of how people make decisions about what mode to use, or there's design elements, there's fuel questions, there's technological questions about vehicle design. These are all things that I can't answer as a geographer. There's social psychologists have to be involved to understand how people take information and make decisions, and there's a political science angle in terms of how these how politicians can successfully run on these platforms and be successful in a democracy where often that's not the most popular thing to be running on, and so exactly these kind of, I'm very lucky to be at McGill where I have access to lots of really bright people in lots of different fields that we can collaborate on and come together and do projects on that try to answer these questions.
I wonder if you can give me maybe an example of one of those projects, something that you're working on now or something that you've worked on in the past that you think, that you either feel particularly proud of or that tackles some of these problems in a particularly interesting way.
Yeah. I mean, one very recent project which got a lot of press in the last couple of weeks, that I was really happy to see, was a collaboration with a colleague in geography who does more of a sort of GIS focused work, and three of our grad students that came together and were working on the name of the article that was published was "The Cars Will Be All Right," and it was basically looking at literally measuring this allocation of space for different modes of transport. And so this meant looking at satellite images and GIS layers and literally going out and measuring like Bixby stations and understanding like how much space is literally used by these different modes of transport, which is because the space in a city, space anywhere, is finite, and it's one of the most contentious things we have to deal with. Is like, what do we make a decision whether this is going to be a parking lot or a park, or whether this is going to be a line of traffic, car traffic, or a line of bike traffic, and these are because it can't be both, right? So these are very real trade-offs that we have to decide whether these things are going to be one thing or another. And what this study showed is actually that even though there's lots of pushback against bike lanes being built, the actual analysis, the actual math shows that they're wildly underrepresented actually in terms of like we could build basically double the amount of bike lanes in the city, and cars would still have enough space to get around and based on current travel patterns.
Yeah, as an interesting example of some of the ways that how it feels to us or what our potentially our ideas and politics around this might influence how we see it, whereas there's actual data that can sort of tell us, well, on the ground it looks like this. So this is work that takes place here in the university, and it's a great place to do that interdisciplinary thinking. But obviously these decisions get made outside of universities, in city halls and in mayor's offices and in other places like that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you make sure that the discoveries you make, that the data you uncover, the conclusions you come to actually make their way out of the university and into the places where they can actually affect cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we try to, as much as possible, we work, a lot of my team works a lot with local politicians in terms of, and local organizations like Bieler Quebec or Equiterre, and these places that are on the ground making a difference in what's out there. And later next month, we're going to get together with about 60 or 70 politicians in the province to talk about active transport policy, for example. And so we're really excited to see where this goes. There's been a lot of interest in this project that we're working on, and so about 60 people have already confirmed to be there, and the goal is to take this farther, to work on some collaboration with these cities. So it's a bunch of folks from Montreal and Quebec City and Sherbrooke and other places in the province who have an interest in saying what can we do differently specifically about active transportation. So this question of what can these cities and small towns do in order to make these changes.
So you're talking about that work taking place in Montreal and in other local cities. You were talking about Montreal and its bike share system, Bixby, earlier on. So many people who are listening to this might live in Montreal, or they may have lived here when they were McGill students. So I think this is a place people will be a little familiar with. Is Montreal a particularly interesting place to do the kind of work that you do? Is it interesting from an urban point of view? How is it unique, and how does it share commonalities with other cities?
Yeah, very, very, very interesting as a city. I think I'm really excited to be here for that reason. I mean, if you think about, the REM, just in terms of like research opportunities, you've got this new, light rail transit going in, which offers all kinds of opportunities to understand, again, how those decisions were made, how it's impacting people's travel behavior, how it's impacting where people are living. I'm lucky enough to be a part of another study where we've done 5 waves of data collection over the last 6-7 years about sort of before and after the REM to understand what's going on with that, and then the city is investing money in new bike lanes, the new metro extension. I mean, there's so much going on in terms of studying what's happening, and which makes it a great place to sort of live and work for me to understand how these things can play out.
And can they be translated to other cities? Is there a global dimension to the work that takes place, even if the sort of living laboratory is here in Montreal?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's things. I mean, any city has its things that are unique about it that make it, whether it's the geography or, in terms of, Montreal is unique for having a mountain and being an island and these kind of things. So those aren't quite the same in Toronto, for example, or Vancouver, but there are similarities in terms of, whether you think about climate or culture or these things that kind of might be similar from one city to another. And then you've got a whole different history in Asia and Europe and places where you don't have as much sort of built-in car dependency as you see in North America. So things tend to happen. You've got sort of denser, smaller urban cores that make it easier to connect with transit and to build bike lanes that are even better than what we have here in Montreal.
So we've been talking a little bit about research, but obviously we are a university, and one of the huge things we do is teach students. So anybody who has the bad luck to be watching this on YouTube is going to see that you and I are definitely not part of Gen Z. But one of the great things about being here is that you get to interact with students all the time. So I'm wondering if you could tell me some of the things your students seem particularly interested in at the moment. When students are coming into your area of study, what's drawing them to that, and what are they passionate about trying to change?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, again, I feel really fortunate that a lot of students seem to really resonate with these kind of questions. I mean, there's a huge demand for studying these kind of urban studies. It's one of the biggest majors in Department of Geography, and specifically around transport. There's just a lot of students who are interested in this kind of stuff, are sometimes even activists, in terms of cycling activists or people who are concerned about pedestrian safety and these kind of things, and who have an interest in parking policy, and so we'll have these very specific interests and things that they sometimes kind of surprise me in a good way, in terms of people are really kind of keeping up with the latest research or controversies around zoning policy around Canada or parking policy and this kind of stuff, and so these because 12, 15 years ago when I was doing a PhD, I mean, a lot of these questions seemed to be the idea of like transit equity and things that didn't really seem to be on many people's radar. And I'm very heartened to see that that's changed dramatically. I think, 15 years ago, I might have gotten a lot of more sort of blank looks when I tried to describe what I was studying, what I was interested in. And that's really not the case anymore. Whether it's students, whether it's politicians, whether, they seem to really be up on these ideas of why transit systems, why transport systems are so important in a city, why the idea of equity and sort of, the distribution of benefits and costs, like why that those aren't kind of foreign ideas anymore.
So I'll come back to that question that I alluded to at the beginning, which is we'll do a little service journalism and give people maybe some travel ideas. Tell me either your favorite city or a city that you think is just a great city when it comes to urban planning and policy and design.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's hard. It's a delicate question. I mean, there's a lot of great cities out there, and I think you can learn a lot. Well, you can have fun and learn a lot from almost any city in terms of what they do well. And I was one city that just really kind of impressed me was Barcelona, in terms of even though I was expecting something good, I was sort of just blown away by the sort of the micro scale, kind of the way they've done the super blocks. They've kind of converted a lot of street space away from cars, and it just felt so safe and vibrant and lively, and there's so much to do, and it felt so safe. And I participated in a like a school, like a cycling school bus, they call it, and like which basically like 100 kids were all on bikes, basically taking over the street space on the way, from a sort of, it was like a 3-mile trip from a square to a school, and it was organized by some local folks there, and it was just a really inspiring experience to be a part of. And they do so much right in terms of just kind of prioritizing what they should be in terms of space for people, not for cars, and making sure it's safe and equitable and fun.
Well, I think Barcelona is a beautiful place, but it's also nice to be reminded that there are ways that we can still affect our cities. It's not that our cities are just a static thing that now we're just stuck with whatever was there, but we can actually improve these places that we all live in and spend so much time. So speaking of time, we're probably out of time, so that might be a good time to stop. But thank you so much, Professor Manaugh, for sitting down with me today. Mark My Words is a production of McGill University Advancement in collaboration with Communications and Institutional Relations. Special thanks to our producer, Frank Roop, and to my co-host, Derek Kassoff, who will be back with you next week. New episodes of Mark My Words drop every Wednesday, and you can find us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch us on YouTube. And you can also subscribe to the show, and you'll never miss a new episode. Thanks, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.